Greetings, everyone. I'm Natalie McKnight, the Dean of the College of General Studies, and we're going to get started here in a few minutes, but we wanted to give folks a few minutes to log on. It takes a while to get everyone in since we have several hundred people. So just bear with us, be patient, and we will be back momentarily. Thank you so much. Greetings again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, I'm Natalie McKnight. I'm the Dean of the College of General Studies at Boston University, and we are thrilled to have you here with us today for the Stanley P. Stone Distinguished Lecture. I'm pleased to say that I've attended every single one of the Stanley P. Stone lectures since they were founded in 1990, well, actually launched in 1990. So I am particularly grateful for alumnus Stanley P. Stone for generously endowing the fund that supports this series. Mr. Stone established the lecture series in '89. As I said, it launched in 1990, and it has enabled the College of General Studies to provide students, faculty, and the general public with outstanding guest lectures every year. Over the past decades, we have enjoyed presentations by Paul Farmer, Miriam Margulies, E.O. Wilson, Linda Berry, Richard Rodriguez, Emily Bernard, just to name a few. The lectures and performances have consistently inspired lively and thought-provoking discussions within and beyond our classrooms, and for that we are very grateful. Stan Stone received his degree in business administration from Questrom School of Business in 1966 after having completed the general education program at the College of General Studies. He received an MBA from Columbia University in 1972 and is now president of Stanley P. Stone and Associates in New York City. Stan is in our audience today, so Stan, thank you so much for your active support of this wonderful lecture series. Before we introduce today's speaker, I want to let you know that we will have a question and answer period after the lecture. If you have not participated in a Zoom webinar before, you'll notice that at the bottom of your screen, there's a little section that says Q&A, and if you click on that, a box opens up where you can type in questions, and our speaker and the rest of the panelists will be able to see the questions and then address them. Today, we are very honored to have Cliff Albright with us as our distinguished lecturer. Cliff Albright is a 2020 Soros Equality Fellow and co-founder of Black Voters Matter Fund and Black Voters Matter Capacity Building Institute, which builds community and organizational capacity related to Black voting power. Black Voters Mattered received national attention in 2017 when they helped to mobilize Black voters during the US Senate race between Doug Jones and Roy Moore. Since then, Cliff Albright and the Black Voters Matter team have traveled throughout 13 primarily Southern states in, quote, the blackest bus in America, end quote, energizing voters and exposing voter suppression. And I think we're going to see some video of that experience today. Mr. Albright serves as an instructor of African American studies at several universities. He previously lived in historic Selma, Alabama, where he focused on bringing financial resources to Alabama's Black Belt region. Mr. Albright attended Cornell University, where he obtained his BS in Applied Economics and an MPS in Africana Studies. He also has an MBA from the University of Alabama. Mr. Albright has contributed articles to and been featured on MSNBC, CNN, New York Times, Blavity, The Guardian, and Full Frontal with Samantha Bee. We are very pleased that he could join us today. The title of Mr. Albright's talk is Faint Not, Using History to Move from Voting Rights to Voting Power. Thank you, Cliff. Oh, Cliff, you're still on, you're on mute.
Okay, sorry about that. Hi, everybody, and thank you so much, Dean McKnight, for that introduction. Thank you for this opportunity to be with you and to be speaking with the entire BU community as part of this lecture series. It's quite an honor. Although I can't tell too many of my friends from my undergrad, where I went from Cornell University. You know, we have this little thing with BU and hockey that some of y'all may know about, but still, it's an honor to be here speaking with you all. And yes, we're going to be talking about, like we said, faint not, and the battle for using our history to move from just voting rights to voting power. And before this discussion is over, I hope that it'll be a little bit more clear what the difference is between just talking about voting rights and voting power. But before we do that, I'd just like to give a little bit of background about me and what my journey has been to even get to this point, because I was not somebody who went off to college with the grand hopes of one day becoming a community activist, a voting rights activist. You know, I got introduced to activism on campus as an undergrad, getting involved in issues around race, around ethnicity, around financial aid, you know, being involved in campus movements that were trying to deal with threats that were being made in regards to campus and tuition and financial aid that would have threatened whether or not there would even still be Black students on Cornell's campus, issues like housing on campus. And so this was really where I got my introduction to being a social justice activist or being a student activist. And so, you know, I love to be able to come back and speak to students, you know, at universities, because I always say that just about everything that I've learned about organizing, I really learned as a student activist. And so that was really what my introduction was. And then when I got out of school, I decided to continue that work, to continue doing community organizing, although not as my main my main, you know, way of living. I was actually working in international development in Washington, DC, and dealing with issues, dealing with African development and other countries. But in my private time, I would remain a community activist working on a range of issues in Washington, DC, including homelessness, including police accountability and police brutality, including housing issues. But I wasn't into electoral organizing, not until I moved to Alabama, not just any place in Alabama. I moved to historic Selma, Alabama. Some of you may know the history of Selma, Alabama, the history of Bloody Sunday, the role that the Selma movement and the Alabama movement played in even creating a Voting Rights Act. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. In fact, we'll be going back to, many of us, thousands, dozens of thousands, will be going back to Selma in just a couple of weeks, because the anniversary of Bloody Sunday and the Selma to Montgomery March, that is coming up in just a couple of weeks in March, the first week of March. And let me just give a little bit background on that for those who don't know that history of Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama. Some of you may have seen the images. In fact, anybody who's familiar with the story of John Lewis, right, the congressman who passed away in 2020, if you're familiar with his story, you know that John Lewis and hundreds of other people in Selma were walking across a bridge in order to go from Selma to Montgomery, when they got to the foot of that bridge and they were presented by rows, dozens of not just local police, but state troopers and county sheriffs and sheriff's deputies. And before they knew it, before they could turn around, that these troopers on horses with batons, with tear gas, were beating them up. And in fact, they didn't just beat them up at the bridge, they beat them up from the bridge going all the way back to the church where the march had originated. And that was a distance of, you know, close to a mile even. And so those images were what were sent out during the local news that evening, you know, breaking news, as we say now. But those images went out, and it changed the entire discussion around voting rights in this country. It led President Lyndon B. Johnson, who up until that point had been somewhat resistant to trying to push through a voting rights act, it led him to say, no, now is the time for us to do this, that these images were so disturbing. In fact, he gave a famous speech where Lyndon B. Johnson used the words of the movement, "We shall overcome." That's how impactful Bloody Sunday was. And eventually those marchers and many, many more marchers were able to finish that march, going from Selma all the way to Montgomery, where Dr. King gave a very passionate and a very famous speech where he asked the question, how long before we would have our voting rights and our full rights in this country? And the response coming from the audience was not long, every time he said not long. And so Selma plays a critical piece in our history, and it plays a critical piece in my development, because again, that's where I moved. And even though I wasn't really into voting rights or electoral organizing, you can't be an organizer and come to a community like Selma with that kind of history and not adjust. And when you're working with and living with people who have been involved in that movement, some who have been on the bridge, a good friend of mine and a mentor of mine was a young girl in 1965 on that bridge and still had the marks on her head to show from when she was hit by a baton. And so you can't be in a community like Selma with that history, surrounded by that history, and not adjust. And so I started to get more involved. And that's what really got me into electoral organizing. But the thing that really flipped the switch in my mind was in the election in Selma in the year 2000, which it was a mayor's election. And in addition to trying to get the first Black mayor ever in Selma, now mind you, this is a city that was like 90% Black, had never had a Black mayor. But not only were we trying to get the first Black mayor in Selma, what we were trying to do was to actually defeat the mayor, whose name was Joe T. Smillerman, who was actually the mayor in 1965 on Bloody Sunday. You heard me correctly. The same mayor that was mayor in 1965 remained mayor up until the year 2000. And you may ask, well, how was that so? And there's a combination of reasons, not the least of which being the voter suppression that had taken place for close to 4 decades in Selma, even with the existence of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But on that election day, on that election night, when the results came in and we discovered that he had lost, when the entire city discovered that he had lost and that we had gotten rid of him, people literally stopped their cars in the middle of the street. You would have thought that it was a big old Super Bowl party in the middle of the street, like the team had just won a World Series or some championship. People stopped their cars. People got out of cars, were on cars dancing. People were in the streets dancing and crying. You know, it was just jubilation. And when I saw that release, when I saw what the power of an entire city coming together and saying, in spite of this history, we're going to come together and use our power, that's when I recognized how much power could be in electoral organizing, especially when it was done correctly. And so that was my introduction to electoral organizing. I haven't really looked back since, including years later when I would come together with a dear friend of mine, Sister Latasha Brown, and we would create this organization called Black Voters Matter, which is what we do now. And we go all around the country talking to, especially in southern states, but we go around the country partnering with local groups, mobilizing voters. As Dean McKnight said, we drive around sometimes on these bus tours in what we call the Blackest Bus in America. And we connect with communities that oftentimes are left out of the electoral process, you know, that they don't receive attention. They're in states that are, they're often thought of as being states that are just written off. They're thought of as just being, especially in the South, of being red states. And so they don't get a lot of attention because they're not battleground states. And then within those states, to make it even worse, you've got certain communities, oftentimes rural communities, that get even less attention and less investment. And there's an assumption that there's no real organizing going there, that the people that are fighting for justice there, that they must not be that advanced, because if they were, then they'd have more stuff, right? And so, we decided to create a fund that would support that kind of work. So we go all around these communities, connecting with voters, connecting with local groups. It's an incredible experience when we do this work. And what we've seen is that when you let folks know that they matter, that they're not invisible, that they have power and they deserve to have power, that when we connect with folks in that way, and then we get them the resources that they need, that we can do mighty things to reshape this democracy, to re-engage in civic engagement. And so we've got some incredible experiences that we've had. We've had cities and communities where we've been able to get people elected that truly represent the community versus some of the representatives that they may have had before that were anti their interests, and so we've had those experiences. But the flip side is this, that we've also seen the experiences with the same kind of voter suppression that we saw when I was living in Alabama for the 10 years when I was living there. The same kind of voter suppression, in some cases, the same kind of voter suppression that even existed before the 1965 Act. We've seen similar stories of intimidation. We've seen, stories of polling places being closed or polling places being moved. We've seen, and we've seen this, increase in recent years, ever since the Supreme Court weakened the Voting Rights Act. And so, these are the things that we've seen. And that's why, we spend so much time talking about this issue of voting rights, because there's a perception that, that we've just been on a linear path in regards to voting rights. And in order to understand what we're going through now, we've got to understand where it is that we've come from in regards to voting rights. One of the things I often ask folks when I'm speaking in groups, and especially younger audiences, is I'll say, well, when did Black folks get the right to vote? And quite often, usually if I was there with you, I'd ask that question and a few people raise their hands and throw out some years. And after a couple of rounds of that, usually somebody will say 1965. And they're talking, of course, about the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But every now and then you'll get somebody who takes it a little further back and comes closer to the true answer to that question. Because the first time that Black folks in the US got voting rights was not in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. It was actually in 1870 with the passage of the 15th Amendment. And that amendment, which this was part of the post-Civil War Reconstruction amendments. You had the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery. You had the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship. And those two together really should have been enough to guarantee the right to vote, right? And you figure, well, if you got rid of slavery, and if the 14th said that all Black folks who were previously in servitude are now citizens and should not be denied rights that are granted to citizens, that kind of should have been enough to guarantee the right to vote, but it wasn't enough. Because what we saw was that in some of the states, particularly the southern states, there were still efforts to keep Black men, I should say, because women still couldn't have the right to vote, but to keep Black people from being able to vote. That's why the 15th Amendment was passed, which explicitly said that the right to vote should not be impeded because on the grounds of race, class, or race or previous condition of servitude. And so that should have been enough. And for a little while, it was enough. For a while, what you saw was that you saw Black senators and you saw Black Congress people. You even saw a Black governor, right? And so you saw Black elected officials at the federal level as well as at the state level in state legislatures, right? You had a brief period of a glowing Black leadership during this Reconstruction period. But it all came to an end when the Reconstruction period came to an end. It all came to an end in 1877 with what's known as the Tilden Hayes Compromise, which basically saw So Republicans able to, in a disputed election, which oddly enough included the state of Florida, but in a disputed election where it wasn't clear who the president was going to be, there was a deal cut where basically Hayes was able to become president, but in exchange for that, they had to decide to take out federal troops out of the South, federal troops that had been pretty much enforcing the Reconstruction Amendments, enforcing the right to vote. And so it was after this removal of those troops that what you started to see was all of those rights going away, including the right to vote. You saw the rise of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. You saw the rise of Black people being removed from elected office, in some cases even being dragged out of the actual bodies where they were legislating. And then you saw a Supreme Court reminiscent to the Supreme Court that we have right now that basically enshrined Jim Crow, not just in the sense of segregation and separate but equal and segregated schools and public accommodation, but Jim Crow in regards to voting, which is what allowed for things like poll taxes and literacy tests and having to count jelly beans, some of the same things that would exist up until 1965 when the Voting Rights Act was passed. Again, why do I go through this history? To make the point that history is not just linear, right? It hasn't just been a steady course from no voting rights to voting rights. It was from no voting rights to Jim Crow denial of voting rights to a 1965 Voting Rights Act. And slowly but surely since 1965, what we've seen, especially in the past 8-9 years, since the Supreme Court started weakening the Voting Rights Act, what we've seen is history going in the opposite direction. Again, we've seen photo ID, we've seen closing of polling places, we're seeing increased gerrymandering. In fact, the Supreme Court just this week issued another decision in regards to gerrymandering taking place in the state of Alabama, where although Black people make up 27% of the population, we only have 1 out of 7 seats, which basically amounts to 14% representation in the state, literally half of what we should have. And the Supreme Court has essentially given a green light to such maps in Alabama. And so, we're seeing attacks on the Voting Rights Act. It was weakened 2013 in the Shelby decision, which was a decision which weakened and took away what we call the pre-clearance clause of the Voting Rights Act. That's the clause that in the act that said that before certain states could pass any laws dealing with elections, that it had to be cleared by the federal government, by the Department of Justice, right? That was a way of making sure that these states would not be able to continue passing laws or making changes, gerrymandering and other things. That's what the Pre-Clearance Act was, or the pre-clearance provision was for, because what they knew is it's harder once it's done to undo it. And so make these states have to get those things pre-cleared by the federal government. That was taken away 9 years ago by the Supreme Court. And then more recently, over the past year or two, other parts of the Voting Rights Act have been taken away by the Supreme Court. And so what we're seeing is that we're going backwards in regards to voting rights. And then ever since last year, and the insurrection and the big lie, right, that has led many states, 49 states that tried to pass some form of voter suppression bill, 19 states that actually passed laws, 34 laws in those 19 states. And that was last year. This year, some of those states are coming right back and trying to pass more of those laws. In the state where I live in Georgia, they passed a voter suppression bill last year, which did things like attacking early voting and attacking vote by mail, attacking in-person voting. You name the form of voting, it was under attack. And now this year, this state is coming back and trying to further attack voting rights and voter access. And so again, all of these things that have been made possible ever since the Voting Rights Act was gutted. And so in our work at Black Voters Matter, part of what we do is to say, you know what, with all this that's going on, in spite of the voter suppression, that we still have power. And that if we come together and organize the same ways that we organized in 1965, that we've got the power, not just to maintain our voting rights, but we've also got the power to go beyond voting rights and into voting power. And so I'd like to, there's a video, because one of the things that we did last year in order to communicate this message that we've got power and that we need to mobilize and fight for voting rights, is that we did a bus tour that we called the Freedom Ride. And that Freedom Ride was named after the Freedom Rides that were done in the 1960s, which were basically about ending segregation on buses. But we decided to do it with a reverse. In the 60s, that Freedom Ride went from DC all the way down to the South to challenge the system of segregation on the interstate buses. We decided to do a Freedom Ride going in reverse, going from the South all the way up to DC, so that when we got to DC, we'd have a whole convoy of people that we were going to bring together in DC for a rally to talk about voting rights. And so if y'all have that video queued up.
Setting off our Freedom Ride for voting rights. So we're down in New Orleans, we're in the historic neighborhood of Tremaine.
Everybody is a freedom rider. Even if you're not getting on the bus, you're still a freedom rider because you're on this bus on this journey that we are taking towards voting rights and liberation. What's going on, Mississippi? We are the heart and the belly of this movement. I am a freedom rider.
Freedom Riders. We had about 4 or 5 folks who were either Freedom Riders or in the lunch counter sit-ins. We had local organizers. Day 3 of the Freedom Ride.
When we flex our collective muscle, we will always win. Can you imagine it? Will you fight for it?
Welcome to Rock Hill, South Carolina.
Others may crawl, but we're all trying to go in the same direction.
I believe
that we will win.
I believe that we will win. West Virginia got something to say.
This is what it's about, and everybody making a demand that we want the For the People Act passed. So we're on our way, y'all. Next stop, going to Richmond, Virginia, and then it's on to DC.
You're not here where you're at! I hear it, and now pass the torch and pass the flame.
And now we're in DC. We are deadly serious and laser focused as we make our demands, and we say we want the For the People Act, and we want it now.
You are founders of a new nation and a new platform. Stand in your radical reimagining of the world.
Thank you for that. So yeah, I hope a couple of things came across in that video. One is that although we are very serious about the work that we do and we deal with some serious issues, we also believe in having some fun, right? That we always believe that you got to find a way to insert some Black love and Black joy and some Black culture into everything that we do. At the end of the day, that was important even during the movement, right? And we consider ourselves students of the Civil Rights Movement, where you wouldn't have a community meeting, a mass meeting that wouldn't have some song involved. You know, most of the times it would be at a church and you have some singing, the choir or the freedom singers, right? But that there was always some culture involved. And we believe that, and we try to incorporate that in all our work. So if you see us in some of these videos where you see us singing or dancing, doing a little electric slide or something like that, it's not because the work isn't serious, but it's exactly because the work is so serious that we've got to find that space to celebrate some joy, to celebrate and use our culture, right? And so I think that some of that came across in that video. The other thing that I hope came across in that video is that, again, in spite of the seriousness of what we're up against, that at the heart of our work is a belief that we will win, right? And that belief is based on a lot of things. Sometimes it's based on faith. Sometimes it's based on spiritual faith. Sometimes it's just based on our faith and our history, right? In the history and the ancestors whose shoulders that we stand on. But that you've got to have that belief. That, in fact, is why I wanted to name the title of this session, of this lecture. I wanted to start it by saying, faint not, because for the past few weeks, even though we had a vote a couple of weeks ago in the U.S. Senate, where they were actually voting on voting rights. You heard us talking about the For the People Act in that video. Since that time, the name of that act had been changed to the Freedom to Vote Act, and it had been changed a little bit, but that was the vote that took place a couple of weeks ago in the Senate, where unfortunately, once again, it could not receive a full vote because of this thing in the Senate called a filibuster. It's a rule that says that in order to either to start debate or to end debate, that you've got to have 60 votes, which when you describe to some people outside the US sounds kind of crazy, right? But that's what it is. But at the end of the day, in spite of that, what we continue to believe is that if we faint not, if we don't grow weary in well-doing, that in due time we shall reap if we faint not. And so no matter what the story may look like on any given day, as long as we have that faith in our work, in the justice that we're seeking, in the love that we incorporate into our work, and in the power that we have as a community, then we believe that we will win. And if I was there with you, I might even have people to repeat that I believe that we will win. And so that's what's at the heart of our work. So I hope that video gave you a little bit of a sense of that. And then the third thing that I hope came across in the video that goes right along with that faint not, that goes right along with that belief, is that we've got to reimagine. You heard my dear friend Latasha's talking about, can you imagine it? There's a lot of solutions to this challenge that we have in regards to voter suppression and voting rights and representation. And some of those involve legislation, right? It involves getting protections back that we have in the Voting Rights Act. Some of that might involve even changing the nature of the courts, right? There's a whole discussion going around about the need to expand the court, how when you're in such historic times as what we're in, and you've got such a partisan court, that is really unapologetically and blatantly acting in a partisan manner, that the only way to correct that is to add justices to the Supreme Court, which has been done in history before. The court did not start with the numbers that it has currently, and it's been changed several times throughout the history. That number is not written into the Constitution. And so there's some discussion around changes like that, about the makeup of the court, either the number on the court or the terms, a 10-year period for the members as opposed to lifetime. But there's those discussions that are taking place. But I would make the case that we've got to be even more radical in our reimagining, that we've got to more completely reimagine what this democracy looks like, right? We've got to reimagine even what does majority rule even mean, right? Because as has often been said, that you can sometimes have a tyranny of the majority, right? That you can have a majority that abuses its power to the point where it seeks to put in mechanisms so that even when it is no longer in the majority, it can still maintain the power of the majority, right? And so there are all kinds of things that we need to rethink when we talk about what does majority rule even look like? What does representation look like as we talk about gerrymandering and redistricting? Are we always going to be subject to how these lines are drawn? And some of you have seen some of these maps where they got the name from a salamander, because some of these maps look like animals or snaking through some of these states. Are we always going to be subject to exactly how strange these boundaries look, or exactly who it is who's able to draw the lines? Or can we even rethink another way of how representation is even determined? There was a civil rights giant not too long ago named Lonnie Guinier, who proposed some radical, in some ways radical ideas about how to rethink majority. And some people thought that she was talking about quotas, or that she was trying to be against majority rule. And it wasn't about being against majority rule, but it was about rethinking what are the mechanisms we use to make majority rule a reality. Not much different from the ways that James Madison asked some questions about what does majority rule mean. There are things built into the Constitution that are built in a way that forces us to think differently about the majority, right? There's some things that aren't in the Constitution, like the filibuster, that are meant to be checks on the way that we think about the majority, even the very nature of the Senate itself, and 2 representatives per state, regardless of the population that's in the state, that was a check and balance that was put on the majority. So the notion of rethinking majority and majority rule is not a radical notion, unless you're a Black woman who's been nominated for a certain position, and then it becomes radical. But that's part of the rethinking that I believe we need to have as we continue to rethink. What does it take in order to make this a more perfect union? What does it take to make this a more reflective and an inclusive democracy? And so I'm going to end by saying this, that as we reflect on this history of voting rights and how it has not been just a linear history, right? As we reflect on that, there's 2 things that I want us to think about. One is this, that although I and our organization, Black Voters Matter, often centers that discussion on Black voting rights, we are always clear about this fact, that the history and the struggle for Black voting rights has always, or even civil rights beyond voting rights, but particularly for voting rights, that struggle, that history, that movement has led to changes in this democracy that has bettered the entire democracy, that the movement for Black voting rights has always moved the needle in a way where everybody has benefited, where other voters have benefited. Think how much of the Black struggle and the Black voting rights struggle has influenced and led to the women's voting rights movement, or has led to younger people being able to vote. Out of that same spirit of perfecting this democracy and opening up access, there was a time where you were old enough to serve in the military and fight, but you weren't old enough to vote. And so that was changed as a result of movement, of opening up the doors for voting rights. So much in terms of disability rights and access for people with disabilities was opened up as a result of this movement. Even language, right? Whether or not people have access to ballots that are in their language, right? That's been a result of this movement. Anytime that we've opened up the door and we have pushed for Black voting rights, it has led to bettering this democracy in a way where everybody benefits from it. So part of what I want us to think about is the ways, as Dr. King taught us, that we are all connected, that we are caught up in a web of connectivity by which, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so although we center our work in advancing, Black voting rights and protecting against voter suppression, we need to be clear that this benefits everybody the same way that having true representation in this government benefits everybody, or else what you find is a situation where you've got elected officials that are picking their voters instead of voters that are picking their elected officials, right? And that's not a sustainable situation. That's not a real democracy. And so when we center Black voting rights and the attacks of voter suppression that have come squarely against our community, it's centered in that. But the benefits go to everybody in this society and everybody in this democracy. That's the first thing that I would like for folks to think of. And then the second thing is this, and it's a very basic lesson. If you remember nothing else, I want you to remember this. Everybody has a role to play in moving the needle and advancing voting rights and fighting against voter suppression. Everybody has a role to play, especially you. If I'm talking to young folks, if you're a student out there, especially you have a role to play, because the energy of young folks has always been the major engine of social change. There's evidence from the civil rights movement. There could have been no civil rights movement without young people. Think about the images of Birmingham and the images of the fire hoses and the dogs being sent out on the children. There would have been no Birmingham movement without the Children's March. Because the reason that was even necessary was because the adults at the time were too afraid to follow Dr. King into some of the civil disobedience that they were doing, right? And so everybody has a role to play, and especially the younger generations have the role to play in advancing voting rights and advancing civil rights. You listening to me right now, you have a role to play. All we've got to do is ask, and it might be a role, it might not be the same role as mine. It might not be to lead an organization. It might not be to be in civil disobedience. It might just be to send a text or an email or to make a phone call. It might be to hold a rally on your campus, or it might be to do something when you go back home to your communities. It might be that you're able to do some artwork that might advance the movement, that might advance the cause. Maybe you're able to just draw up a sign for one of these things. Even though you can't speak at a rally, you might draw up the sign. Maybe you're the one who's helping with the food food and the water and the snacks. Maybe you're the strategist. There's a role for everybody to play in advancing our voting rights. Even you, no matter what it is you think you can or can't do, you've got a role to play as well. The only thing to do is to ask whether or not you will answer the call. And I'm gonna end this by giving this story. Since I mentioned the Birmingham Children's March, I'm gonna tell the story of a young man who was a high school student in Birmingham when that movement was taking place. And before they had the children go out and do the protest, they had a meeting, a church meeting, as would often be the case, a mass meeting at a church. And so he goes to this mass meeting, just kind of curious. He's not really committed to, being in the struggle, but he's going to this meeting because so many of the other young folks were going. And while he's there, he's sitting there, and he notices that there's a young lady there who he's kind of interested in, right? And so when they get up to the point where they ask the students to stand up, to say who's going to participate in the march, who's going to be in the rally, who's going to be in the protest, she stands up. And so he says, well, heck, she stood up, so I stood up. all I knew was I wanted to be wherever she was going to be. And so this was his entry point into the movement, into that children's march, right, as a high school student. And so fast forward a little bit, he participates in the march and he gets arrested, and he starts to learn more about the movement and about the cause of civil rights. And he gets connected to Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And the next thing you know, he's in Perry County, Alabama, which is a rural county in Alabama. And he's leading up a rally there, right, in a march there, but he gets thrown in jail while he's trying to organize. As a result of him being in jail, some of the local people in Perry County, they organize a march to go to the jail to try to support him. But on the night of this march, the police find out, they attack the marchers, and there's a whole melee. In the midst of that, a young man named Jimmy Lee Jackson was murdered by an officer. And it was that murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson, which people were so upset about, that they said, you know what, we want to take his body in a coffin. We want to bring the coffin all the way from Perry County to Montgomery, Alabama, to bring it to the governor, to make the case about how wrong this voter suppression is, and the treatment and the brutality that we're facing is. But some folks said, you know what, that's a long walk. That's a long march. That's about an hour and a half, a 90-mile march. That's too far to go. So instead of going from Perry County, what they decided to do was to go from Selma to Montgomery. Are you following me? And so it was that death which led to the Selma to Montgomery march. It led to Bloody Sunday, and it's what ultimately led to the passage of the Voting Rights Act that I talked about earlier on when I started my discussion with you. And so think about this chain of events, right? If not for this young man, and his name was James Orange, he would eventually become Reverend James Orange, because he would commit his life to civil rights activism and to labor organizing. But if this young man had not gotten involved in that Birmingham movement, then he would not have wound up in Perry County. If he doesn't wind up in Perry County, the unfortunate death of Jimmy Lee Jackson may not have happened. But if that unfortunate death had not happened, we may not have had Bloody Sunday and the Selma to Montgomery march, and we might still not have a voting rights action. This is a chain of events that started because young man decided to get involved. Now, whatever his reason may have been for getting involved, your reason might be different. But the question I need you to ask is, what is the chain of events? What is the history that can be made by you taking one decision that says, I'm going to get involved. I'm going to stand up. I'm going to show up. You listening to me tonight might be the key link that leads us to the victory that gets us the next wave of the next Voting Rights Act, or maybe something even bigger than the Voting Rights Act. So what I need you to do is to faint not and grow tired. Don't grow not tired or weary in well-doing, but to make that decision, and in due season we shall reap, if we faint not, if we stand up, if we get involved. We all have a role to play. And if we each make that decision, then I promise you, I believe that we will win. Thank you. And I'll be glad to continue the discussion with any questions.
Albright, that was so inspiring, so informative, so inspiring. I feel like skipping dinner and not sleeping tonight and going out and doing something right now. So, sign me up. So
all right.
I'm gonna open the Q&A panel here, and Cliff, I don't know if you can see these, but I can read them because I don't know if our audience can see them. So
I can see.
Given voting rights have regressed in recent years, would it be better to return to the exact rules in earlier years, like 2018, that could get through the current political structure, if one could actually do that?
Yeah, well, we'd have to go a little bit further back. We'd have to go back to before the Supreme Court gutted at least Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which was in 2013. That would be better than the situation we're in now, where right now we don't have the pre-clearance provision, right? So states are able to pass all these laws and they don't have to get pre-cleared by the Justice Department. And we don't have, we have little of Section 2, which is what gives the Justice Department the ability, or other courts even, the ability to look at some actions that the states have taken, like the maps in Alabama that I talked about earlier, to be able to look at that and say, you know what, this map looks like an unfair dilution of Black voting power. And so right now, those two elements really don't exist. And so we'd have to at least go back to 2013 before the current Supreme Court started to gut the Voting Rights Act. But I want us to think even more imaginatively, right? I think we don't want to just go back to that, because there are things that we need to add in that weren't in the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Some of that stuff is in the current legislation that's pending. For example, the 65 Act didn't really deal with overturning elections, which is part of what we're seeing now, where you're seeing that some of these states are passing laws that will make it possible for a partisan state legislature to ignore the results in their state and say, you know what, I don't like those results. We're going to get rid of those votes. We're going to get rid of this one county's results. We'll change the numbers. Literally, the thing that the former president was asking the Secretary of State of Georgia to do. Some of these laws would make that be possible. And so there are new elements of voter suppression and election subversion that need to be dealt with that aren't even in the existing 1965 Act. And so there's some new things that need to be thrown in to make the situation better. So we don't want to just go back to pre-2013. We want to actually move forward and not be having to defend voting rights, but even thinking about how can we be more expansive and do this even better. And guess what? That's part of what we saw happen during the pandemic, where some states out of necessity said, well, we got to do more vote by mail. We got to do more to try to make it easier for people to vote. And guess what happened? In doing that, it expanded access and there was record turnout. So we need to be thinking about how to move forward, not just how to go back and hold on to what we used to have.
Great answer. Yeah, thanks. And I think I'm going to try to compress a couple questions here because we've got a lot of them coming in now. But
Okay.
so one of our audience members says, what can we do to stop gerrymandering, especially in states that we don't live in? And I think this ties into a larger question I'm seeing from several folks. What can we do, period? And I think you got us all fired up and ready to go, but what are some of the specific things we might do? But let's start with gerrymandering, which is deeply disturbing, and you characterized that very well.
Yeah, so a couple of things that people can do. Again, there's the battle for the federal legislation, which actually deals directly with gerrymandering. One solution that they deal with is by having, instead of it being a partisan process, that it's done by independent commissions, right? And so there's things within the federal legislation that would prevent partisan and racial gerrymandering. So getting that legislation passed is a part of the answer. And there are things that, I'll say in a second around what people can do to work on that. We're actually our organization is doing a campaign that we call 1 Million Voters for Voting Rights, where people can get involved and pledge to take actions. And then we forward you different actions that you can take. Anybody who's interested can send us a text. You can text voting rights, one word, voting rights, to 25225. I think I got that right, 25225. Voting rights, and that'll get you connected with us, so that you can find out what those actions are that you can take on that. Along with that, though, I'll say this: you don't have to connect with us. Connect with another organization that's doing this, right? Connect with another national organization. League of Women's Voters has been doing some incredible work. People for the American Way, NAACP, Stand Up America. I mean, there's lots of organizations that are in this fight for voting rights. And so connect with one of those organizations. It doesn't have to be us. Connect with a local organization in your state, in your city that is dealing with these issues, dealing with expanding access and fighting for voting rights, but connect with somebody, because that's the key to how we get victory. The more united we are, the more organized we are, the easier it is. And so again, if you don't know who to connect with, you could reach out to us and we'll let you know, depending on where you live. We'll tell you somebody else that you might be able to connect to, but get connected to somebody and get connected at the local level, because part of the success around gerrymandering, and we're doing this right now in Louisiana. Our bus is in Louisiana right now doing a multi-day bus tour to raise awareness about redistricting and the maps that are being drawn. A lot of that is going on at the state house, at the state capitals. So even in your own state, just getting involved and going to the state capitol, taking part in some of those hearings. Now, I'm gonna warn you, sometimes they do those hearings in a way where they say they want public input, but they don't really want public input. In fact, right here in Georgia, one of my colleagues was saying that for the public input on one of these pieces of legislation, they were limiting the input to 1 minute. And like she said, you can't really get your substantive feedback out in under 60 seconds. So sometimes there are things that they do, even though they have to have public input, where they try to limit it, but still, whatever there is that's available, take advantage of it. Go to these hearings, go to the capitals, find out about what's going on, going even to local board of elections, right? Because some of this stuff takes place at the local board of election. Sometimes it's the local county level board that's trying to close polling places and things of that nature. I know we were talking about gerrymandering, but still, the point being that there are different levels where you can engage: federal legislation, state legislation, and gerrymandering hearings, and even at the local level. But mainly get connected to somebody, find a trusted source of information so that you can get connected and get the information that you need.
Great advice, and thank you for really pointing out the importance of local politics, because I think we often don't hear about local politics much in the news, and then we don't think of it as important, but that is often where these things begin, and that's where you can sometimes have the most influence. But then if you do both, if you do that and get involved locally, then join the national organizations, then you're kind of working both ends. So great. Since you couldn't hear us applaud because we're on this Zoom webinar, I just have to share this one because it's not a question from Kimberly Feng, but just stating how awesome Cliff and Latosha are. I had the privilege of hearing, is it Latasha, I think, give a keynote speech. Latasha. I had the privilege of hearing Latasha give a keynote speech at a conference last year, and Kimberly's loving your presentation today. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you so much.
Okay.
And Latasha sings much better than I do, so I'm not gonna torture you with a song the way she would.
No, we could have a sing along. I love that. Okay, so this is a good one because we have so many students on board, probably a few hundred actually. You mentioned that you realized what you wanted to do with your life while you were in college, because we're all about that age. Not everyone, but a lot of students are on with us right now. What can we do to expand voting rights as college students?
Yeah, well, a couple of things, and on this question, some of you might have a better answer than I do, because the realities of what you're dealing with there on campus. Sometimes with some of the voter suppression that we're seeing, sometimes it's targeted at college students, right? Because we know that students, tend to be a little bit more progressive than some of the older communities. And so, and definitely on some issues like climate change, right? You're definitely more concerned there. And so sometimes these provisions are targeted at students. For example, in some states where, say, it's easier, Texas being one, where it's easier for you to not just easier, but it's possible for you to use your gun permit as a source of ID, but you can't use your student ID as a source of ID to be able to vote. I don't know if that's what the situation there is in Massachusetts, but we have some states that are like that, where they make it harder for students to vote. We have some some states or cities that, you know, they carve up. I've been on campuses where one half of the campus had were in one district and another one was in a whole nother district, and they had two completely separate polling places that they had to go to, and neither one was very convenient. So sometimes students get the short end of the stick. So one way to get involved in improving voting rights is to even look at what are the specific issues that are impacting you all as students right where you live, right? Or if you don't vote in Massachusetts, if you're still registered and you voted at home, like what are the things that impact, you know, because the whole discussion around voting by mail impacts students largely when you're still voting in your home state. And so, you know, looking at the specific issues that impact you all, I mean, that's the thing that you'll probably be most passionate about, looking at those provisions and getting involved in trying to change those if you can, or if you can't change them, then working with each other to educate each other around like what those provisions are, like what are the vote by mail requirements, you know, what are the polling place requirements, what are the ID requirements, you know, what's the provisional ballot regulations, you know, finding all that out so that you can be being more informed just about the voting process altogether. But I think definitely that there are issues affecting campus students in particular that, you know, I think are a natural source for people to start to organize around and do some education around and start trying to impact some policy on that.
Yeah, great. And I just want to point students to BuVotes, which is a BU-wide organization that actually started here at College of General Studies. One of our social science professors began it, actually a couple of them. And we have regular voter registration drives here where we help students register to vote either here or in their home state. And I didn't see anything as crazy as what you said, Cliff, about Texas, but I know in some states like Florida, it is really very difficult to register to vote. You know, you have to, it's like every single county has a different requirement, and most people don't, and you have to register by county, and so many people don't even know what county they live in.
That's
So
right.
yeah, it's nuts. So from Christopher Rhodes, who was kind enough to suggest that we invite you. So thank you, Christopher. He said, great talk. You mentioned how the images of police violence against Black marchers in Selma, Birmingham, et cetera, helped change the minds of people across the country and even convinced President Johnson to fully support the Voting Rights Act. How do current voting rights activists convince the rest of the country that state voting laws aren't just Black issues, but issues that everyone should care about in order to move the needle, as you said, to everyone's benefit?
Yeah, it's a great question, and definitely want to say hi to Professor Rhodes. There's two ways of answering that in terms of how to connect those dots, right? One is, how do we connect the dots between why it's important, and then how do we connect the dots in a ways that just kind of raises the awareness and gets people motivated into getting involved, much the way as the question suggested, you know, the Bloody Sunday did during 1965. So let me take the first part first. You know, I think it's important that what we recognize is that when we don't have voting rights, right, that it impacts everybody on a range of issues. Even if you think that this is just a Black issue, which is not, right? It's centered in anti-Blackness, right? But it's not. It doesn't just impact Black folks, because, as I said, you know, the vote by mail requirements impact. It may impact Black voters disproportionately, but you've got some other folks who may have also been using vote by mail, and now they're impacted as well. So there's a disproportionate impact, but it's never just us. And so part of what that means, though, is that we don't have a really reflective democracy if we don't have elected officials that really represent the electorate, and that impacts a range of issues. You know, the voters' person that takes place in some place like Texas, and there's been a lot of bad coming out of, or Florida, right, or some other states, but I'm just use Texas as an example. That voter suppression has led to what? It's led to COVID running out of control, right? So even if you're not a Black voter that was impacted by the voter suppression, you are somebody who's impacted by a governing body that has failed on health issues, that has failed on their electrical grid in Texas, which has literally led to people dying when they lose power because of bad weather. That's a result of voter suppression. If you're somebody who believes in reproductive justice, right? Maybe not everybody does, but if you believe the polls in the country, the majority of the country does, right? But if you're somebody who, or at the bare minimum, if you believe that somebody who's been a victim of rape or incest should not be subjected to having to have that baby, then guess what? You're impacted by the voter suppression as well. The voter suppression doesn't just impact the people that it keeps from voting, it impacts everybody that is affected by bad policies that get created by a government that doesn't feel like it has to be responsive to the people because it's so isolated. Think about Congress, right? Here you have, now you can't get 90% of this country to agree on just about anything, but 90% of the country agrees on background checks. But we can't get background checks for gun violence. Why? Because we've got a Congress that is so isolated from its voters that regardless of what 90% of the country wants, it won't allow it to happen because of its relationships with gun manufacturers. And so, what you find is that the voter suppression, which again may be rooted in racism, impacts the entire system to the point where everybody starts to suffer. And the odd thing is that this is what happens with racism and other manifestations as well. Racism that was originally targeted at Black workers winds up distorting the entire labor force to the point where the entire labor force's wages are held in check. Racism that's targeted towards the school system, right, winds up dumbing down the school system and weakens public education to a point where everybody starts to suffer. Not to mention, even if you look at the attacks on so-called critical race theory, they're talking about critical race theory, but then what are they attacking? They're attacking books on LGBT issues. They're attacking books about the Holocaust, but it's all under the guise of critical race. So again, something that starts as anti-Blackness winds up affecting anybody in a much wider segment of the population. So that's one way that we try to get people to see that voter suppression is not just a Black issue, it's an issue about this democracy and about whether or not it's going to be representative of the people and whether or not everybody's going to suffer from bad policies. The second part of that answer, though, and I'm gonna say this real quick because I know we got other questions, is unfortunately, part of how we have to bring this home to people, even after we connect those dots between the issues, is for people to see how serious this is. And unfortunately, what that's meant over the year is that we've had to go from, and again, everybody has a role. Some people can send a text, some can make a phone call, some can send an email, but we've had to escalate to using Dr. King's principles of nonviolent civil disobedience. I've been arrested 5 times just within the past 8 months at different protests at the Senate, at the White House. And so, it's been that civil disobedience, which has kept the story in the news in some cases, which has really made other people see how serious of an issue. Because if you don't see somebody willing to go to those lengths, then you start to think, oh, this isn't that bad of an issue. So one of the lessons that I learned actually as a campus activist was that your demands have got to match your tactics. If you have a very basic demand, then you don't have to go to, let's take over the building, right? If all you want to do is put on a little program or something, then you don't have to go to the full extreme. But if the thing that you're fighting against is trying to fight against something as old as the filibuster, something as structural as voter suppression, then you will have to use different kind of tactics that match the type of demand that you're making. And that's why we've done a call. That's part of what the Freedom Ride, that bus tour that we showed in the video, was about. It's about encouraging everybody that we are going to have to revisit some civil rights tactics of nonviolent civil disobedience. I encourage everybody, if you've not read it, or even if you have read it, go read it again. Dr. King's Letter from Birmingham Jail. It is, I mean, it's one of the most classic, most valuable pieces of writing, more valuable than his I Have a Dream speech, right? Which to some people is blasphemy, but read that letter and it lays out the purpose and the principles of nonviolent civil disobedience. That's one of the tactics that we use to get everybody to see that we're all connected. It's an important issue. It affects everybody, and that we've got to be willing to do different kinds of things in order to get movement on this issue.
Thank you, Cliff. We have so many more questions, so clearly we're going to have to have you come back at another time, because I'm afraid the Zoom webinar will just cut us right out, which would be just
Oh,
terrible.
no.
I'm going to let the last comment go to the founder of this series, Stanley P. Stone, who wrote at the end of the Q&A, he said, excellent presentation, and he just feels so proud that he was able to sponsor this series that brought you here, and hopefully we'll bring you back, because this was wonderful, and hopefully next time we can do it in person and extend the conversation over a reception or something of that nature. But thank you so much for informing us and for inspiring us. And just you're doing such wonderful and important work. And I think you've developed a lot more allies today.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm sorry my answers were long were long, but if there's some questions, I don't know if there's a mechanism where if you want to forward me the questions and I get it back to you, I don't know if there's a way to share it with folks. I'd be glad to do something like that as well if you like. But in any event, I'm also take you up on the offer to come back and finish it out. So thank you.
You can do that. All right. Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Stanley Stone, for founding this whole lecture series. And I look forward to having you back, Cliff.
Thank you. We will win. Can't stop, won't stop.
Take care. Bye-bye.